we're over in Mark chapter 8. Mark Mark has a what do I want to say? He he runs through this story pretty quickly, and in the 16 chapters that are involved here, he tells the story of Jesus pretty rapidly, and we talked about that earlier. How many times he uses the word immediately, and so we're in Mark chapter 8, and familiar uh, passage, something that we've looked at before, but Mark puts it in a really different kind of juxtaposition. He puts two things together here that give us some kind of insights, maybe on kind of what human nature is like. And in Mark chapter 8, and I'm going to begin reading in verse 27. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the village near Caesarea Philippi. And we've talked about Caesarea Philippi. I shared with you all about that on a previous chat time. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets." Then he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Verse 31, then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. So Jesus, by the way, Jesus' favorite name for himself was Son of Man. That was when Jesus is speaking of himself, he uses that title more than any other title. But Jesus begins to tell the disciples, and this is after Peter has declared that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Christ. He's the one that was promised to come, and Peter makes that declaration, and this is a short time later that Jesus begins to tell them, "Hey, this is what's about to happen. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, even though it's not contained in this particular description of the events that are taking place." But he begins to tell them that he's going to suffer, and the religious leaders are going to persecute him, and religious leaders are going to come after him, and that he's going to be killed. And 3 days later, he's going to rise from the dead. And he begins to tell them about the events that are to come, which we know today are so critically important for our salvation, is the fact that Jesus suffered, was crucified, was buried, rose again. We know how critical that time was. And so Jesus begins to predict his death to the disciples. Peter has just declared that he is the Christ, he is the Messiah, he's the promised one, and Jesus begins to describe to them events that are about to take place. And verse 32, as he talked about this openly with his disciples, this wasn't something hidden, this wasn't something that he did with just a few of the disciples, it wasn't the inner circle. He just began to share this with the disciples that were there. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took Jesus aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. I hope you get this picture in your mind. Peter's personality is on display throughout the Gospels and throughout the book of Acts. We see his personality, and he takes Jesus, who he has just declared as the Messiah, and when Jesus begins to talk about that he's going to suffer and die, Peter pulls him aside and he says, Jesus, you don't need to be talking like that. That you're 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 talking about stuff you don't need to be talking about. Can you? I'm just trying to get this picture in my mind that Peter goes from declaring he is the Messiah, he's the promised one, he is the Christ, and and he is the Son of the living God. And Jesus starts talking about his suffering and his death that's coming, and Peter goes, "Hey, Jesus, you and I need to talk. You need to." I mean, Mark uses the word reprimand. That's to me that's a pretty strong word, and he tells Jesus, we need to talk here. You need to quit talking about stuff like that. Peter goes from declaring that he's the Messiah, Jesus saying, "Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven," to now Jesus turned around, looked at his disciples, and then reprimanded Peter by saying, "Get away from me, Satan. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God's point of view." Uh, that, that Peter draws Jesus aside, and Jesus goes, "Peter, I just got to tell you, you're wrong." In fact, you're acting like an agent of the enemy. You're acting like an agent of Satan. Uh, you got to get away, because what I'm telling you is the truth. And he reprimands Peter in front of all the disciples, and he tells him, "You got to understand something, Peter. You're only seeing things from human point of view." He says it's not God's point of view. You know, sometimes in our life, things happen and we have our point of view, but we don't have God's point of view. You know, I think about Moses when he fled into the wilderness after he had killed the Egyptian, and he spends 40 years leading sheep in the wilderness for his father-in-law. And I can't help but believe that Moses saw it as a horrendous time in his life. But he didn't have God's perspective. Because from God's perspective, Moses was in training because he was going to be leading a huge, large, massive group of people through that same wilderness. And what Moses saw from his personal perspective as being punished, as being harmed, as being hidden away, nobody can see what's going on, and out of that, God is using it as a training time in his life. Today, I don't know what you may be going through, but the challenge to us is, instead of looking at things from a human perspective, that we would see it from God's perspective. That God says he's going to turn everything to our benefit. That those who are followers of Jesus Christ, that he is going to turn those things to our benefit, even the hard things, even the difficult things. And sometimes when you're in the midst of it, it's hard to see that. I'm sure Moses went through that. Man, how hard this is. I'm just out here tending sheep, and somebody has described it that Moses spent the first 40 years of his life thinking he was somebody. He spent the next 40 years thinking he was nobody, and the last 40 years finding out what God would do with somebody who thought they were nobody but put their trust in God. And so my challenge to you today is to put your trust in God, and do your best to see it from God's perspective. Because, man, we see it from our perspective, and it can be discouraging and downheartening. Man, this morning I was on a Zoom call and heard just an incredible testimony of God taking the difficult things of life and turning them to incredible blessing and benefit. And that's who our God is today. Father,